Hi there, today I shall be discussing the topics involved in my dissertation, titled The Existence of Systemic Racism Within the Film Industry. As the title implies, I have been researching the history of film and the relationship it has with black culture since film's conception in 1895, as well as demonstrating a few of my own reference points I've discovered whilst conducting my research. To begin with, I'd like to show you a quote from the great Denzel Washington, as I believe it explains the importance of involvement from a member of the community that the film is about. As one of my points I go into describes how executive producers in the industry will tell minority stories to make money instead of aiming to teach the uneducated population. As the interviewer asks, why do we need a black director? Could a white director not? And before she can finish her sentence, Denzel interjects by saying, "It's not about colour, it's about culture. Steven Spielberg did Schindler's List. Martin Scorsese did Goodfellas. Steven could direct Goodfellas, and Martin Scorsese probably could have done a good job with Schindler's List. I know, you know, we all know what it is when a hot comb hits your head on a Sunday morning, what it smells like. That's a cultural difference, not a colour difference." Here, what Washington is clearly stating is that only someone who is black can do justice to a film about black culture, as only then can they know what it actually feels like to live how they live, and the same with other communities. In terms of topics, I divided my dissertation into 5 different areas. To begin with, I look at a brief history of black film, where I go into the birth of film, as well as the birth of black film specifically, the creation of the first black production company, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, black icons during the early stages of film, as well as how black people were treated both on and off of camera. Following that, I look at what I call the start of the millennia, where we see how film quality has progressed over the last 100 years, as well as the representation of black people within those films. As well as that, we look at who the new icons are of this time, as well as how black stories are starting to be told and how they've changed over the last 100 years. However, I also want to look into how bigoted views still remain within these films and how there's still a lot of work to be done, as well as going into a new form of racism that I believe has begun to surface more and more over the last few years. Afterwards, I want to look into modern media, which is the beginning of a new trend of making black films. Although this may seem good on the surface, and don't get me wrong, it most certainly is, because the more representation that is out there, the better, but also how this can be a form of manipulation from executive producers. I also wish to discuss the difference between a film directed by a white person and a film directed by a black person, depending on the subject matter of said film, as discussed earlier. And finally, when looking at modern media, I want to look at how a black film produced by a major company, run by someone not of that culture, is fueling this sort of form of racism I mentioned. Penultimately, I plan on looking at the bigger picture and looking at acknowledging the benefits of the last 100 years and how it has massively helped views of foreign cultures to become non-bigoted to most of the population, as well as exploring what this new form of racism mentioned throughout actually is in great depth, as well as explaining how it flies very much under the radar if not researched properly. And then to cap things off, I want to look to the future, where I express my own thoughts on how we can improve the industry, whether I think we're already on the right path, and then expressing who I think are the frontrunners in making sure black cinema is being portrayed in the correct way. The way that I intend on structuring my extended essay is by following the chronological order of when events and topics that I look into took place. So by doing this, I start by following the passage of time from film's early beginnings, then jumping through the decades to see landmarks of change within the film industry, viewing where the film culture stands currently, then taking a step back to see the issues laid out as a whole, before explaining whether or not we need to make a change, or if we are on the right path to full cultural understandings. In terms of film resources that I've used in my dissertation, a few examples include The Realization of a Negro's Ambition, which is a film that was released in 1916 and was the first feature of the very first all-black production company, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, established that year by Noble Johnson. Much later in time, when we look at 2017's Get Out, which was directed by Jordan Peele, I discovered it was created to shine light on a subconscious form of racism that most people may not even realize that they take part in, where they place black people on pedestals to show that they support them instead of actually just treating them like regular human beings. And finally, also the 2021 version of Candyman, which was released as a sequel to the 1992 original and was created in order to bring the series back to its roots as a story about the lives of those who live in the black neighborhoods and how their treatment has changed in the almost 30-year time difference, as well as continuing the legend of Candyman, who was born out of racial discrimination and killed through hatred from white people. When looking at the people who influenced my research, those who stand out in particular are people like Noble Johnson, who I discussed earlier, who set up the first all-black production company, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. This foundation set up their remit of destroying the black stereotypes being displayed in cinema at the time, primarily in slapstick comedy. One of the figures they were strongly against was Stephen Fetchit, who was a black person featured in many slapstick films as the stereotypical lazy black man. His stage name was even derived from the phrase Stephen Fetch, which was a derogative term used during the slave labor era in America. It was because of his actions and his display of his own people that many audiences who were a part of the black culture were strongly against what he was actually doing, believing him to be taking steps backwards instead of steps forward in black progression. In terms of organizations and movements, I also go into the Oscars and how they have had a history of snubbing black actors and creators, even in the modern day, which further fueled the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 after the tragedy of George Floyd's death. In terms of the books and journals that I discovered whilst doing my research, I found many resources that were very insightful, but those that stood out in particular to me were things like The Hollywood Black, The Stars, the Films, the Filmmakers, which is an important piece of material as it provides a look of all cinematic history for black actors and creators in the industry, looking from the very beginning at the silent film era of productions, where instead of actually using black actors, they would have white people play in blackface. Then fast forward to further down the line, where performers like Stephen Fetchit rose to stardom, as well as to more recent talents and events such as performances of those such as Viola Davis and productions by creators such as Ryan Coogler. As well as that, there was also Redefining Black Film, where in this interesting look into how black films are made, author Mark A. Reed looks into what it truly takes to call a movie a black film, and whether they could be considered such if made by a white filmmaker. Similarly, he also talks about how if a major film about a black culture is created by a black writer and a black director, can this still be considered a black film when the real people with power, the producers, are white? and have the final say of whether scenes get added or cut, and thus an argument could be made of it's their film and not those of the creators, depending on how much people in that position have altered the final outcome. Finally, there's also representing hip hop culture and the productions of black cinema. This book is a look into the two main achievements in cinema, which is that of Spike Lee's influence on the industry as a whole, as well as the rapid increase in what the author describes as ghetto-centric films. This book looks into how there is a distinct contradiction in American society on the progression of black cinema and how it overexpresses their culture in an attempt to make it seem normal in order to be accepted to society. However, it also opens the doors to expose how black youths are the targets of a fierce racial backlash for trying to express themselves and therefore not being able to normalize their culture like they want to in cinema. In terms of the conclusions I wish to show that I have reached, I firstly want to express my own views on where cinema has been, where it is, and where it's going, as well as showing how I have learnt that it's not as straightforward as I initially thought. In addition to this, I wish to display that I have learnt that black cinema was independently started a lot sooner than I anticipated, and as well as being a lot more successful. I also wish to show that I have learnt about the founding fathers, as well as which ones were looked more favourably. For example, Stephen Fetchit not so much, but Noble Johnson much more so. Then I also wish to show that I have learnt as time went on during the 20th century, it wasn't until the last few decades where major leaps in black cinema were taken. But with the good, there must also be the bad, and I also want to show that I have learnt that even in our modern age of cinema, there is still a lot of restraint on not just black representation in film, but in all minority representation, and although some aren't as bad as others, all need to be looked into and informed about to the masses. This has been my breakdown for my dissertation, and thank you for listening.